If you like big blocks, then I have a project for you. To make this star, you will need 4 10-inch squares for your star and 4 5-inch squares for your star. Then you will need a high contrasting background fabric cut into 12 10-inch squares. The first thing you want to do is pick out 4 12-inch squares that you want to be the area between the legs of your stars. These can be the same color or they can be 4 different colors. That's up to you. Here I've chosen to do mine all purple. You will want to mark the center of one side of this square. Here I just finger pressed a little seam in one side of the square. Once you have your center marked, you're going to take one of the 12-inch squares that you've decided will be your star, and you're going to lay them diagonally. You want it to come a little past the center line of the top edge, and they can come as far down on that right edge as you want. You just don't want it too close to the bottom corner because you want it above the seam allowance. We are going to sew a 1/4 inch seam allowance down the edge of the white fabric. Before sewing, double check to see if when you flip the fabric back, it covers the upper corner of the background fabric. If you need to, you can pin the fabrics in place. We're going to take this fabric to the sewing machine and we're going to do the same thing on all 4 blocks that we've chosen for our background fabric. Once you have sewn a piece of your star fabric to your background fabric, we're going to get them ready for ironing. We want to iron the fabric as we sewed it to set the seam, and then we're going to flip the white fabric back over the background fabric and iron it down. So now that we have this ironed, we're going to flip it over and we're going to trim off the extra white fabric. We will just line our straight edge up with the edge of our background fabric and cut. Once you have trimmed your star leg, you want to flip it back and trim off the background fabric. We don't want this to show through and we don't need the extra bulk. We are going to use the white fabric that we cut off our one star leg to make another star leg for each block. We're going to overlap that at the top where our center line is, and we're going to sew a 1/4 inch seam. We're going to flip that back just to double check that our angle is good and will cover the background fabric when we iron this. Once you have the leg sewn on, you'll take it to the iron and press it. Once the block is pressed, we'll flip it over and we'll trim it as we did before, following the edges of our background fabric. Once we've sewn on the star legs, we'll flip up the fabric, the star fabric, and we'll trim off the background fabric. To make sure that I don't see this purple fabric through the white fabric, I'm going to trim off a little bit extra here. So you'll see me trimming off just a little bit of the white fabric as well. Now you should have 4 blocks that look like this, that have the star legs attached to them. With the remainder of the background fabric, you should have 8 10-inch squares. We are going to cut all of those in half diagonally. Now that we've cut this fabric diagonally, we're going to have to be careful with it. We have cut it on the bias and it will very easily stretch. If you're working with fabric yardage, you can use spray starch or sizing to stabilize this fabric before you cut it into 10-inch squares. If you're working with pre-cut 10-inch squares, I would not recommend spray starching them. When you spray starch fabric, it shrinks, and it tends to shrink more in one direction than the other. So if you were to spray starch 10-inch squares, pre-cut squares, you most likely won't have a square left after the starching process. It will change shape on you, and you won't have a perfect 10-inch square anymore. I made 2 of these table toppers, and I made one using spray starch, and I made one without using spray starch. Both of them turned out just fine. I felt a little more confident using the spray starch because the fabric was a little stiffer, but in the end they both turned out just fine. You'll have plenty of fabric that you can trim off to square up this if it goes wonky on you. Our next step is to sew these triangles onto the block that we just made. So we'll start by sewing one on the bottom and one on the top. And here on the bottom I used matching fabric, but for one of my other blocks I did not. I made the fabrics different. The great thing about this pattern is you could use 12 different colored background fabrics if you wanted to, or you could use one. I think they would equally give you nice results. Here I'm using different fabrics to make a table topper, and I think it's a good idea with this topper to lay these fabrics out and make sure that you like them. Audition the fabric, because with this only being 4 blocks in this table topper, if you have 2 that you don't like together, you really can't move them very far away from each other. When you're making a big quilt and you have, say, 36 blocks, if you don't like 2 of them together, you have a good opportunity to move them around the quilt to put them in a place that you like them. So for this table topper, I think it is a good idea to audition your fabric before you sew it together. Once you have your fabric layout decided, you'll want to sew these triangles on each side of the star point block. You can simply fold them in half to get a center mark, and then line up your center marks, your triangle center mark and your block center mark, and then you can lay them out and sew them on. Once you have sewn on your triangles, you're going to want to iron them with the seams open. This will help you later when you're lining things up, and it'll reduce bulk. Once you have your fabric ironed, you're going to want to cut off these extra points. And on this one I'm showing right here, you can see that I did not iron my seams open. And I actually made one table topper where I didn't iron the seams open and one where I did. And the one where I ironed all of my seams opened turned out better, and it was much easier for me to line up. Once you have those points cut off, we're going to go ahead and sew on our other sides, our other triangles. You're just going to line them up the same as before, find your center marks and put them together, and then sew them with a 1/4 inch seam. Once you have sewn on your final triangles, you're going to want to iron this block really well and iron all the seams open. When you have all 4 of your blocks completed, you'll want to trim them up. Since we sewed on the bias, your blocks may not be the same size or shape. So I think the best way to approach this is to measure all 4 of your blocks and see which block is the smallest. Then you'll want to trim all 4 blocks the same exact size. And for my block, I was able to trim all of them at 15.5 inches by 15.5 inches. When you're trimming this block, take note of the center square, the points, the corners, and try to have a consistent amount of fabric on each side of these points. We're going to be lining up the seams, so as long as you're consistent with that, things should line up. You're probably wondering what we're going to do with those 5-inch squares. We're going to mark them diagonally, and we're going to sew them on top of our block right above the star legs. So we're going to do what they call a stitch and flip. We're just going to sew that across diagonally, and then we're going to flip our fabric up and iron it down into place. So once we've sewn each of our 5-inch blocks, we'll iron them in place, and then we'll flip the fabric up and we'll iron that down. Once we have our corners ironed into place and everything looks lined up correctly, we're going to trim off the excess fabric. After you've trimmed your corner square, you're going to want to go back and iron the seams open. The blocks will fit together much nicely if the seams are nice and flat and open. Now that we have our 4 blocks completed, we can sew them together. We're going to line them up so that the white corners are together in the center, and then we're going to try to match up all of our seams. Looking at the back of this block, you're going to want to try to line up these seams the best that you can. And it's better that they line up. If your top of your block and the bottom of your block are off a little bit, it won't matter that much because you could always trim them up before putting the rest of the block together. After you've sewed 2 blocks together, you'll want to iron the seam open so that all of this will fit nicely together when you do your final seam. Once you have sewn your 2 blocks together and you have 2 sets of 2 blocks, you will sew them together in the center, matching all your seams and lining up as much as you can. It's all right if the ends of the fabric do not align. You can always trim this block later. I pinned all of my seams together so that I could try to get the best alignment that I could. When my 4 blocks were sewn together, I went back over them with an iron and made sure I had ironed all my seams nice and flat. Once your 4 blocks are sewn together, you may need to go back and square up this whole block. To get my seams to line up, I had to shift the fabric down a little bit and maneuver it. It's really no big deal. We're just going to square it up. To make a border around the block, I cut up 2-inch strips of fabric. To sew on my border, I started with one side of the block, sewing the strip down with a 1/4-inch seam. Then I went to the opposite side of the block and sewed on another strip of fabric using a 1/4-inch seam. I trimmed the tails off of my border fabric and then I sewed on the other 2 sides of the border. Once you have your border trimmed, you'll want to go back and iron your pieces flat. I ended up ironing my seam allowance towards the white fabric because there was just too many seams going towards the dark side of the fabric. I got my inspiration for this table topper from Missouri Star Quilts. Jenny has a tutorial she calls a Star Shine Quilt. In this tutorial, she uses 10-inch blocks, but she cuts them into 5-inch blocks, and then she makes 36 blocks, which end up making 9 stars. I watched this tutorial and I really liked the quilt, but I didn't want to make 9 stars. So I decided to figure out how I could double the size of a star and make that the focal point of a project. I came up with this idea for this giant star that ends up making a great table topper, and it would also make a great center to any quilt. I want to thank Missouri Star for inspiring me, and hopefully I inspired you to go forth and make a big star. Hopefully you liked this video. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Have a good day.